This review is for Dressing a Galaxy, The Costumes of Star Wars by Tricia Biggar, published in 2005 by Abrams. I actually think the book itself was sort of conceived and designed at Insight Editions, but then actually published by Abrams, so it's sort of a joint venture. One of the things I want to point out straight away is this dust jacket. It has French folds, which means it's a lot more sturdier at the edges, because one of the things I hate about a lot of dust jackets is that the edges are so easily damaged or curled or teared, but when you've got French folds, it makes them essentially sort of twice as thick and twice as sturdy, and it's hardly ever used in books, so it was really great to see. The actual book itself has a cloth cover, of course, and as I mentioned, it's written by Tricia Biggar, who was the costume designer for all three of the prequel films. I think the criticism I most often make with making of books is there's not enough depth, they don't go into it enough, everything goes by too quickly, there wasn't enough text, blah blah blah, which is true, but at the same time, most movies only get one art or making of book if they're lucky, and only have, around 200 pages to cover an entire production, so every area of production whizzes by so quickly, which never feels quite enough and always leaves you wanting more. But then the great thing about being a Star Wars fan is that because it's such a popular and long-running franchise, there have just been so many art and making of books for these movies, and in fact I'm very sure that it must have the most art and making of books out of any film or television franchise ever. And so what's really cool is that then you get books like this, which are entire books just focusing on one aspect of the production, with other movies that only get one book. The costuming section might only be, less than 8 pages or something. But for Star Wars fans, now here we have an entire book that is actually probably bigger than most whole making of books for other movies, just dedicated to the costumes, which I just think is so cool. Obviously, I like all art and making of books, but it's these Star Wars books that are just focused on one particular area that really enjoy and really speak to me in terms of the craft of filmmaking. Because it's only in books like that that you can truly see the insane level of attention to detail that goes into every single aspect of filmmaking, which as a fan I just revel in. So this book is obviously dealing with the costumes, and now one very important thing to note that you may have already started to notice as we're going through is that this is just a book for the prequel costumes. Now on the dust jacket and in sort of like the blurbs and stuff you might read online, in fact, in his preface for this book, George Lucas says that this book brings together the costumes from all 6 movies for the first time, which is kind of technically true in the sense that at the back of the book there's a photographic index of thumbnail-sized images for what I understand is to be all the costumes from all 6 Star Wars movies. There are a couple of photos in some sidebars for some of the costumes from the original trilogy, but to pretend that this book is anything other than 99.9% focused on the prequel trilogy is just misleading. And so for a long time there was nothing on the costumes from the original trilogy, but then, like I was saying about how great it is to be a Star Wars fan, and we get all sorts of really great specific books. In 2014, Chronicle Books released a book called Star Wars Costumes, the Original Trilogy, which was very similar to this book, but of course focusing on the costumes from episode 4, 5, and 6. And in terms of comparing the two, it's actually quite interesting. In my reviews, I often like to differentiate between whether I think something is good objectively versus subjectively. Subjectively, I actually prefer this book just because I like the imagery better. I like the costumes for the prequel trilogy. There's just a lot more variety and they're a lot more elaborate. And of course, I absolutely appreciate the simplicity in the designs for the costumes for the original trilogy. And of course, with the prequel trilogy, they obviously had a lot more money and, in fact, a bigger universe to play with, more characters and things like that. So just in terms of sort of sheer variety of things for your eyes to look at, I do prefer this book. However, having said that, that's my subjective opinion. Objectively, I actually think the costume book for the original trilogy is far better. I found that book used its space a lot better. It was sort of like jam-packed with stuff and had a lot more variety in terms of images like sketches and models and things like that. And the text that's in the original trilogy book is so much better. There's so much and it's really great detail. This book, remember how at the start of the video I was kind of saying how My main complaint with making of books is that they don't offer enough insight and text and stuff. That is still actually a criticism I would level at this book. Each chapter or area does open with a pretty good, maybe like 2 pages worth of text, and then there are sidebars throughout that sort of explain things and point things out, and it is really good. There's just not enough, and also this book does occasionally feature a lot of blank space sometimes that really could have been filled up with some great insightful text. So from that perspective, I felt that the original trilogy book was much stronger and much more insightful. One thing I really liked was at the start of every section there were costume illustrations for different pieces, only like maybe 15 or 20 per section, but they were still pretty cool. It would have been good to see more of those and see them included next to the final costumes throughout the book, which is actually what they ended up doing with the original trilogy costume book. Also, one of my main disappointments was that this book doesn't have any really true behind the scenes pictures of things, in the costume department, of the process of these costumes being made, of, the costumes in various stages of the fittings, of anything like that, which I thought was a really dumb omission. And then there are also some other Star Wars books that focus on specific areas of production, like Sculpting a Galaxy, which is very similar to this book, but like dealing with the models and miniatures and things like that. There's one called The Sounds of Star Wars, which is obviously about, sound effects, sound design, things like that. And then there were 2 volumes of Star Wars storyboards, one for the original trilogy, one for the prequel trilogy. And this book also reminded me a lot of the Star Wars Chronicles books, which are not really as good as any of the other books that I've mentioned. They're just sort of like these, they're kind of hard to explain, almost like these photographic scrapbooks of just pictures of everything from the movies. And then those books I've just mentioned don't even come close to covering all the art books and other making of books for the Star Wars movies. So there's a pretty great collection. And when you take all that into account, I think it's very exciting, because if you're someone who, say, is interested in costume design, it can be kind of hard or tedious if you're trying to learn about costume design and you buy just a making of book for any old movie, and then you only get a couple of pages on costume design that isn't going to be really in-depth. And so it's just so cool to be able to have books like this that are dedicated on specific areas. Obviously, like I said, this one really didn't have enough text to really sort of explain. I mean, what I ideally would have liked for this book is to almost be like a case study for costume design in Hollywood movies. Like, this should have been the sort of book that if you're taking some sort of costume design course at a fashion school or film school or whatever, that your instructors would have put on your list of books you need to read to learn about costume design in Hollywood. And you would have to use a movie like Star Wars for something like that, because it's such a pop culture touchstone that everyone's seen it. But now I'm sort of moving into the realm of wishful thinking. So getting back to the book itself, so I mentioned the text isn't that great. However, the pictures are really, really great, as you've already seen as we're going through. One thing I don't think my crappy camera is going to be able to give you a true representation of is just how high quality the photography and then the reproduction of the images in this book is. Really, really well done. Also, the paper quality for the pages is really nice, really thick. I think 157 gram paper, which is very pleasing. However, the book doesn't actually cover every costume from the prequel trilogy. When you get to the back, there's sort of like this thumbnail size index section that I think does include sort of like a list of all the costumes that were used. But for the costumes that are featured, the photography is just so great. It usually gives you like a full body shot, and then it'll show some area of detail, like a really, really high quality, really close up detailed look at some aspect of the costume, which, as someone who is a gigantic Star Wars fan and has seen all the movies a bazillion times, it's really exciting to notice things that I have never seen before, because I've never seen them in that detail. And I think if you're the sort of person who's interested in cosplay or costuming replicas, things like that, this book's sort of just going to be invaluable for the sort of detail that it can show you. This book was also published to coincide with an exhibit they were having for the costumes at one of the institutes in LA. And then sort of the last important thing to touch on is the limited edition for this book. Now, if you've watched some of my other videos, you might know that I am not a fan of collector's editions of any sort. I don't really like the spirit of the thing, the idea that charging 3 to 10 times the price for maybe a little bit of exclusive content that is then made prohibitive to a lot of fans just because, they don't have the money to throw away on such extravagant purchases kind of feels like they're getting a little screwed over. But then there are other collector's editions where they don't actually include any real exclusive content. It's more just like a slipcase and an art print and a signature or something, which then feels like it's screwing over the people who do buy it. So, and then because it's so expensive and precious, you feel like you can never really use it and whatever. I'm just not a very big fan of the idea. It feels like a lose-lose situation for all fans, whether you buy collector's editions or not. However, the limited edition for this book was definitely one of the most impressive that I've seen. There's so much in there that I'm going to forget, so I'll just, in the back of this book, actually, it tells you exactly what's in the limited edition book, so I'll just read from the back of this so I don't forget anything. The limited edition is encased in a handmade clamshell box wrapped in fine Japanese silk with a custom-made obi wrap closure. The limited edition includes 5 additional gatefolds, 7 booklets, and 4 inserts. The booklets are the P9 costume overlay, cut from a different cloth, digital costumes, the costumes of the Mos Eisley Cantina, headdresses, classic costumes, Darth Vader, creating the perfect villain, and behind the seams. Didn't. The inserts include a postcard sheet of costume details, a paper doll fold-out, and a footwear wrap. Also included in the limited edition are an authentic Wookiee buckle replica, a vellum envelope with a fabric swatch from the material used in Darth Vader's cape, a Dressing a Galaxy DVD with costume commentaries, and a special folder of 16 of Trisha Biggar's favourite costumes, which contain actual swatches cut from the same fabrics as the costumes as preserved in the Lucasfilm archives. The limited edition is accompanied by a certificate of authenticity, and each copy is hand-numbered. So I think there were 2,500 copies of that made, with 1,000 of them signed by Trisha Biggar. And so even though I don't really like it in the sense that I don't really like any collector's editions, I will say that is a pretty impressive and well done limited edition. And very tempting, although nowadays the price for buying it secondhand must be ridiculous. So ultimately, I really enjoyed this book. However, I don't necessarily think it's the sort of book that I would want to recommend to every single Star Wars fan, because it doesn't need to be. I reject the idea that a book's worth is based on its popularity. This, like I said, is a specific book, so it's for people who are specifically interested in this sort of things. You can be a Star Wars fan and not particularly interested in the costumes, in which case that's cool. Maybe you're more interested in the models or the storyboards, and there are books for those. I just think it's so great to be able to have a specialized, beautiful, well done book for the people who are interested in this sort of thing.